Okay, so in this lab exercise, we're going to play with classes and IDs and upload the code or two screenshots, one of your CSS and one of your HTML, to show me that you correctly created CSS rules for class and ID, and that you correctly identified those elements that belong to the class and a single element with that ID. So what we want to do is create some HTML elements, assign classes and IDs to them, and then target them inside of our CSS. So first thing that we want to do is create a basic HTML structure. So we start with our doc type declaration, followed by our HTML tags. Then inside of our HTML tags, we have a head and a body. We have a head and a body. Oops. There we go. So we'll be working in the head and we'll be working in the body. So the first thing that we should do is assign some style classes inside of our head tag. So that way we can write our CSS separately from our HTML. So remember, anytime that we're inside of these style tags, we're outside of the realm of HTML. Inside of these style tags, purely CSS. Alright? Okay, great. So let's start by creating some HTML elements. We'll create, let's go with an H2. You can use any elements that you want. Alright, so I'll just say, go with React. We set a P tag. Let's say React is awesome. If you don't know, React is a web development framework, right? It makes web development, makes it easier once you get to the advanced levels. Okay, and it makes websites more maintainable across a large team. So our second H, let's create an H3, just for some diversity, right? Let's say this is, let's name this JavaScript. Let's create another P tag. Let's say JavaScript is everywhere. Great, we have our HTML elements. Now all we need to do is target these inside of our CSS. But before we could even target these, or well, we can target them, and I'm going to show you multiple ways that we could do that, right? I'm not going to spend too much time on doing it this way because that it won't meet the requirements of our lab exercise. So we could set. Actually, I'm going to give you the starter code inside of the Zoom chat. We're going through lab exercise classes and ideas. Okay, and at 9 o'clock you have a quiz. So I sent you the starter code inside of the VLE if you want to use it. Sorry, not the VLE, the Zoom chat. Okay, so we can target these elements in HTML as is, right? Because we could just target the element name, right? Let's say we want to React or our H2 element. We'll have a font size of 50 pixels. We could do that, right? Or maybe we wanted to change the color. Let's change it to red. That isn't going to work, right? You could even see that when I use this color property and value, red, it cancels out my previous CSS declaration because I didn't insert a semicolon at the end of that declaration. Okay, every CSS declaration has to have a semicolon. Okay, so we could target our elements just by targeting the element name. Remember, when I say element name, that's the H2. H2 is an element name. P tag, P is an element name. H3 is an element name. Okay, but we don't want to target our HTML elements that way. We want to assign classes and IDs. So remember, you could think of IDs and classes as a real world scenario. Each one of you has a BTVI student ID, but if you didn't know, you also have a class ID. So everyone can be identified by their individual student ID, but as a group, you also can be identified by a class ID. Okay? So IDs in HTML should be unique on each element. So let's have this an ID. Assign it an ID of React. Let's assign this a class of paragraph. Let's assign this an ID JavaScript. And let's assign this an ID, a class paragraph. Okay. Now that everything has an identifier, whether it be an ID or class, we could go back inside of our CSS or in our style tag and we could target these elements. Okay, so we have an H2 that has an ID of React. So to target IDs inside of CSS, we use the hashtag symbol and then followed by the name of the ID that we gave it. So hashtag React, and mark curly braces, and our CSS declarations that we want to target or assign to this ID goes in between these curly braces. So we can assign a color property and a value of green. Okay, so we come below our first CSS declaration and let's target our JavaScript ID. So hashtag followed by the name of the ID that we want to target. Curly brace. Let's change this color to gold blue. Okay, nice. Now here's here's something you probably didn't know. I could assign an ID and a class to one HTML element. Right? I could assign an ID and a class to one HTML element. So say for instance that we wanted to assign some CSS properties to both of our H2 elements. We could give that a class, right? So even though my H2 has a unique ID, I could also assign it a class. So I'll call the class heading. And I'll also assign this H3 a class heading, right? And I could come inside of my CSS, and remember, if we wanted to target classes in CSS, we use the dot symbol followed by the name of that class. Okay, and so let's say I wanted to change the font size. Let's go with 50 pixels. Okay, great, nice. And so you don't have to do that step where you give your heading elements, the H2 and H3 a class, right? Just trying to show you that you can assign a single element a class and an ID, right? So I want to target my paragraph. So I use a dot, then followed by the name of the class, which is paragraph. And then let's change the font size. Let's go with 20 pixels. Let's change the color. Go with violet. Okay, great. So again, if we wanted to write CSS inside of our HTML, we have to use the style tags inside of our head tag. Okay, we assign some HTML IDs and classes to our HTML elements, and then we went back inside of our style tags and we target those elements with CSS. If you want to target an ID, you use the hashtag. If you want to target a class name, you use the dot symbol. Okay? And that is lab exercise classes and IDs. Do you have any questions?